Thank you.
I hear your voice now, I think. Here we are, Paul Spiegel's very warm welcome. And let me give a brief introduction to Paul. Paul runs the Center for Humanitarian Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And the center, I was on its advisory board for quite a long time. It sort of works on the huge issues of evidence-based response, so that when we respond to disasters, we know what works and what doesn't work in different disasters. And Paul has been heading the center now for how many years, Paul?
It's now just about 7 years.
7 years. So now we're welcoming you to the Bankinter Foundation Future Trends Forum. We're talking with you about food security, and we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.
Well, that's really, I mean, in a sense, it's given a sense of urgency to what we're talking about. And maybe you can tell us exactly where you are right now and what took you there.
Sure, and I hope my internet will stay. I'm actually currently in Amman, Jordan, and I'm moving to Cairo on Friday. But I'm here to respond to the Gaza crisis with UNRWA, which is the UN Works and Relief Agency. Its headquarters is in Amman, Jordan. And yeah, so I do this as part of my Hopkins work, but also from my previous life when I was with the United Nations. So once a year I respond to a major emergency, and sadly there couldn't be a more major emergency than what's happening right now in Gaza.
So, Paul, maybe you could step back a little bit and tell our audience here about the need for evidence in responding to disasters and how that hasn't always been the case, and what the Centre in particular does to provide evidence so that we use money and resources wisely in trying to help people.
Sure. So the humanitarian community really was built at the beginning, early on, in the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and others that when started decades and decades ago now. It was really based on goodwill and volunteerism, and less, I would say, on evidence and responding. It was primarily doctors who really wanted to do good, and that was excellent. And the spirit, particularly with MSF, still lives on. And that was my earliest experience, actually. In 1992, I was with MSF in Kakum, a refugee camp, starting that camp with the Lost Boys of South Sudan. But during that time and since, we've learned that there really has been a lack of evidence in humanitarian settings, because there was the suggestion that it's so acute, like with what's happening right now in Gaza, it's so acute you can't do research. Which is incorrect. You can do research, you just can't do it in the same comprehensive, stable situation that we're often used to. I would say that the field has taken leaps and bounds, improved in leaps and bounds in terms of evidence, but there's still a tremendous amount that we don't know, and particularly particularly the multi-sectoral nature. And I know you're talking a lot about food security and for example, what's happening now in Gaza, you've got a lack of food, you're increasing malnutrition. It will take time for acute malnutrition to occur, but on top of that, you've got huge water problems and you've got infectious diseases. And so all of that combines to make things much worse, and so much more complex to address. So those are some of the things that the Centre tries to do, is number one, undertake research in difficult situations using different methodologies. Number two is of course, we do a lot of training, and then more and more, we've been trying to use this evidence to undertake strong advocacy across the world with a humanitarian lens and not a political lens.
So, Paul, you sent me a message this morning when I got up, and it said, "I'm trying to help, but this situation is really, really difficult." You've had a huge amount of experience with UNHCR and now with the Centre. What makes this situation so particularly difficult? And I can think of many answers, but just in terms of providing humanitarian response.
Yeah, it's one of the few situations, there have been others, where I use the word, there's no release valve. People are not able to move out to a protected country. They can't, many are already Palestinian refugees, but they're not able to move into Egypt or into Israel or to adjoining countries to get safe haven. And so, for example, what I was thinking about when we texted this morning is we have deployed now with UNRWA, so I'll say we, but UNRWA has, there are now over 1.1 million refugees in 97 shelters. And there's hardly any water because of the siege. There's hardly any water or food getting in and medical supplies. And we now have some various outbreaks, but one of that I was dealing with this morning of likely a hepatitis, acute viral hepatitis. And the main reason and the main way you deal with this is to ensure improved water and sanitation. But in these areas, supplies are not coming in. There's not enough water, so we can't actually try to address the main cause of the transmission, which is fecal-oral. And on top of that, we can't. It's a rare situation where you feel very frustrated but helpless, because in many other situations we can surge in people, we can bring in goods. Right now, the goods are very, very, even with the humanitarian pause right now, the goods are not coming in, and therefore there's so little you can do. And I'm working with our colleagues. We do have, UNRWA has 650 healthcare workers, Palestinians, who are working still, and the frustration is just palpable.
Wow. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, again, measuring response, because I remember your predecessor, Tom Kirsch, going into Haiti after the earthquakes and going around. He's a disaster response doctor, going around and asking people if they'd actually been given such basic supplies as food and water in the response. Do we collect data, and is data being collected now in Gaza to sort of show what people are getting and what they're not getting, and whether the right kinds of resources are reaching them?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's always a bit frustrating because my background is a physician and epidemiologist, so we build on data.
I'm a data
so
guy.
I mean, so the answer is yes. Yeah, I'm a data guy, but the problem is that it's not. I was just dealing with this in the last hours. We have all the lists of the 97 shelters. We have how many people, how many pregnant women, some idea of latrines, but what we need to look at, and we always compare indicators. So the indicators that I'm aware of right now in the shelters is that a doctor is seeing approximately 140 patients per day, and the standard is in an emergency is maximum 50, and the goal is to have 20. We don't really have an idea of how much water per person per day, but it's certainly less than 5 liters per person per day, and then the sphere emergency standards is 15 liters per person per day. And there's 1,000 people per latrine, for example, in these places, and the goal is to have 20 people. So there is pretty good data. It could be better. We're trying to figure out how to provide care to pregnant women, and we're counting the number of pregnant women in the shelters, and it's lower than it should be that we expect. So we now have to think about how do we find out where the rest of those pregnant women are to make sure that they're able to deliver. And there's even now we have websites up that we're able to look, and people are able to upload data. But another peculiarity is that all the UN and the NGOs are sending in. They have received funds, and they're trying to send in goods in through Rafah crossing, but how, it's the Egyptian Red Cross and the Egyptian government together, I guess, with the Israelis who are ultimately making that decision, but we don't really know what goes in. And so even just tracking some of this to know which medications we have to prioritize makes it difficult. So there's a lot of data, but the quality can be difficult, and you either have to interpret it or, I'm careful because the people that I'm asking for the data are doctors.
I lost sound. Paul, I don't know if you can hear me, but I've lost your sound right now. Paul?
Be more and more precise there. UNRWA, I'll end this part by just saying the attacks on the health care facilities and the UN. But it's not deliberate attacks on the UN. It's just that people are dying in their houses. So UNRWA has had 109 people killed in 2 weeks, which is the largest amount of UN workers that are killed in this situation.
So I'm going to open the floor to questions in a second, but before I do so, I have a question for you, and that's about using technology. Obviously, data is very helpful in this, but are there other areas where you have seen recent technological change or look forward to technological change that would make response much easier for you? And if you have an example from the food security area, it would be wonderful, but I'm just curious about how you perceive changes that could come around and could help you in these undertakings.
Yeah. The answer is yes, for sure. Technology is made a huge difference. I can give some specific examples, which, the best is working, and in this situation, it's a bit more difficult, so I'll move towards Ukraine because where there was still, because of Starlink, there was still satellite activity here. It wouldn't work because often there's not enough fuel and the electricity, and there are deliberate blackouts. But just in terms of trying to look at nutrition and nutrition surveys, for example, which are so key for what we do, and we have very specific types of surveys called SMART surveys. In the past, it was all done in paper. Now, of course, we're using tablets. Everything is uploaded from the field. We're able to look, and if things seem suspicious or wrong, we're able to correct. But what I'm hoping, that's just a very practical example. What I'm hoping, though, to do, and this is something that I was just 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was in London and Geneva, looking at the effects of climate change and technology, in particular particularly artificial intelligence. And we have a goal now, the Centre, and we're going to be working with, we can't do it alone, we'll have to work with a lot of colleagues, but what we want to be able to do is use a variety of technologies, particularly to measure displacement. So that would be satellite data. In Ukraine, we used a lot of Facebook data, good data, and then we can do crowdsourcing. We want to look at, I mentioned all the social media, and then data scraping to get an idea of where people may be going. And then we want to be able to, if we know the demographics and the epidemiological profile of these people, we have more and more evidence that we can put into computers, and using artificial intelligence, we can try to figure out what would be the best evidence-based interventions to use and the most cost-effective, because, and this is the key, and then I'll end, is that right now, in most humanitarian settings, we ask for a certain amount of money, say 100 million, but we get 50 million. And we really don't have a very good way of using evidence to prioritize the best interventions for morbidity and mortality. And I think that we're going to be able to do this with big data in the nearest future.
You lead me to one more question before I open it to the floor. I went into Paradise as the fires were just dying down there, and we were able to, using Facebook data actually, see where people went immediately, but it was very short-term data. And when I went back a year later, it was incredibly hard, in the US at least, to figure out where people had relocated to. I had to do it, I did a minimal job, but I made many, many calls and found they're distributed. There was no central means of figuring out whether they had gone to live in a similar circumstance and faced similar, in fact, some did, similar risks from fires. Some were burnt out 2 years later in another fire. Whether there was any support that was ongoing for them. Do you have long-term data now for people when they're displaced like this, or do you lose them after the immediate sort of cell phone data disappears?
Right. No, we do, but it depends. For example, with UNHCR, many of the refugees are registered, so they're in a database. And then, sadly, when we know that when refugees or displaced populations are receiving something, they keep their cell phone numbers up to date. And therefore, we have been doing serial surveys over now 10 years, and with the Syrian refugees, both in Jordan and Lebanon. And a lot of it relates to food security, and we've been able to show an increase over time of a worsening of food insecurity amongst these refugees over time.
A worsening of food insecurity.
Yeah, because particularly those in Lebanon, the Lebanon economy is tanked, and there's been more and more discrimination against the Syrian refugees, and the international community has been receiving much less money than we had previously received for Syria. A lot of it has been, it's not a zero-sum game. The number is increasing, but the needs are greater. And so, for example, Ukraine is oversubscribed, and I'm sure the Gaza crisis will receive a lot of money. But there are so many other situations where there's not enough money, and therefore things get worse over time.
So I'm going to open, I see a couple of questions coming up already. Martin, in fact, your colleague from Hopkins, Martin Bloom, has a question. He's sitting right here.
Paul, I have a question, because, I assume that Gaza had a healthcare system in place. And I was just wondering, could you make optimal use of the health cards or something which was existing before the crisis?
Yeah. In fact, what's interesting is they have, and particularly UNRWA, because it's been around for 70 years, sadly, they have a very strong an electronic health information system. And the problem, and we are using that. For example, we previously, when I came, it's only been 5 days now, but they were looking at last year's consumption, but we're now able to use the e-health records to be able to understand the medication and the hospital sundries, gauze and everything else. We're now able to look at the consumption according to the e-health. So that has been very positive. The hard part, though, is that the 97 shelters where this 1.1 million people are there, UNRWA has set up in each of these at least one medical point, but the health information, they didn't exist before. These are mostly schools now that have become these massive shelters. The health information system there did not exist, and it's still basically pen and paper at this point. So we have a very strong still in the 9 out of 22 health centers that are functioning. We have good e-information. Another lesson learned, something so simple in terms of technology, but the e-health, the e-medical record system was not designed to do anything offline. It's only when it's online. So we've had so many now, electricity, there's not enough fuel, so that there are a lot of breaks in the system because they weren't able to continue with it offline.
Another question for you.
Yes, one question. I was wondering, the support, the financial support for those refugees and the food insecurity, is it consistent, or do you see like a fashion mode that there is a support, then there is no support, there is a big gap? And because I see that a lot in ONGs, for instance, the ONG where I am on the board, and I was wondering at this larger scale if it is the case and what to do.
Yeah, it definitely is the case. And I mean, my area is mostly in refugees and internally displaced persons, and the World Food Program, let's say, is the big player in terms of providing food, and then UNHCR would work with the World Food Program, of course, Mark Bloom knows as well, and we would move into more cash and cash vouchers. But in terms of food, and to add, in terms of food security, or insecurity, is that in many situations, refugees are not able to farm or to cultivate, and therefore they really are nearly 100% dependent on food and or some menial labor. But in most situations, they're not allowed to have an income. And a lot of the funding whether it be for WFP or World Food Program or for UNHCR is country specific, and it can even be commodity specific. And so over the last 10, 15 years now, we've seen more and more disruptions of the food supply that is provided. And it's very, very difficult. It's primarily because of the donors. So the donors are giving funding, and generally, particularly with the World Food Program, it's been quite earmarked for certain countries and even for certain commodities. So in order to address it, it would be nice perhaps to always have what is need-based as opposed to more a donor deciding. But But as we know, humanitarian aid is not just according to needs and neutrality, but governments use this as part of their political system and how they want to see the world and where they want it to change.
Did I see a question? Do we have any more questions around? Is the one down there? Sorry, I keep people's hands moving. I think that question's coming up. So I actually have a question about, again, it's a sort of, or an innovation question about the kinds of foods you can give people that might save them now that would have caused malnutrition, or, are you seeing changes in what you can provide in these circumstances that make saving people easier? And maybe Gaza is not the best example of this, but in your career, have you seen advances that have, and Martin, I'm sure, can address this as well.
Of course. Sorry, it came in.
I was asking for whether you had seen advances in the kinds of foods that can be provided to people that will save people now who would have died of or suffered from malnutrition badly. Are we in need in other, in terms of just the food we can provide? I think maybe we're having a sound problem. Yeah. Martin, do you want to take it while we wait to see
Paul? Yeah, we're just going to take my...
Oh, okay. Go ahead, if you can hear us.
Yeah, no, I can. I think... I wasn't sure that was Martin speaking. Yeah, I mean, so I'm sure Martin would be on the same line. Everything from provision of micronutrients, and Martin was a big leader in that, to provision of therapeutic foods. And so there have been huge advances in the last 20 years with people that have either severe or moderate acute malnutrition. So we're not talking chronic. And there have been changes in the types of foods that have saved a huge amount of lives, ready-to-use therapeutic foods, RUTFs. And also there's been a big change across the board in terms of moving towards community feeding for acute malnutrition, as opposed to, meaning that the foods can be given in the community, as opposed to early on people with severe acute malnutrition, and even some moderate, but certainly severe, were always in health facilities, which was way more expensive, and they would be catching other diseases as well. So there have been tremendous advances in that area.
And before we let you go, I have a question. I know it's something you wanted to address, and that's the issue of polycrises, where you're dealing with an issue of conflict. We've got climate change, there are natural disasters. What does that mean for the response world that you're working so hard in?
Yeah. Sadly, I'm pessimistic today, but it's the future, particularly with climate change, but also with changes. So certainly climate, and that's going to have a massive effect, as I'm sure you've been discussing, on food insecurity, droughts, as well as significant increase in conflict, particularly over water. So I would foresee a huge amount of displacement. Not all displacement is bad. Some of it may be voluntary and moving towards areas where there's better economic outlook. But I would predict also there'll be an increase in forced displacement. But then there's also other issues, such as the political climate that we're seeing, and the dramatic increase in populism, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee. A huge watering down of many Western countries of the 1951 Refugee Convention, even of asylum we're seeing, and it does not bode well, I would say, particularly because most of the conflict and the humanitarian situations we see are becoming more and more protracted. So in the past, at least, some were becoming they ended, and therefore you could actually provide funding elsewhere. But now one still needs to be able to provide this longer-term funding to these protracted situations, and we're still having more and more situations. And we've seen, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be Syria, let's see with Gaza, many of these, once this starts, it's people are displaced, and it's for years or decades. We don't really have very few short conflicts where people are able to go back home quickly, and climate change is only going to exacerbate that.
Paul, Martin has his hand up, so we'll give him the last question.
Yeah, Paul, could you just explain the magnitude of the problem? Because I don't think that sometimes people realize how big this problem is it's just too good to mention in numbers. Sure.
Of course, don't want to show slides, but it's the numbers of people now. We now have over 110, probably not even 112 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. So it's a massive amount of people, and they're primarily in low and middle income countries. And here I'm not talking about economic migration. Talking about primarily people moving, could be due to natural disasters and drought, and it could be but much of it is due to conflict. So it's the largest number we've either ever had or certainly been recorded since World War II. The numbers have gone up in terms of funding, which is good, but as I said, relative to the need, not even close. And it's actually quite recurrent in many countries. So the problem is this fragility leading to conflict is spread in many, many countries. So if you look at Nigeria, then in Northeast Nigeria, Congo, Somalia, some of this has been going on for decades or even generations. And it's the idea of moving forward to trying to find peaceful resolution, which is generally political in nature, has also changed. The Security Council being completely dysfunctional, and given the cleavages we see right now politically, I think it's going to be less and less likely that we're going to be seeing political solutions to these areas. So the magnitude is massive, and it's sadly because of climate change and the consequences that will happen. This is bigger. I don't want to make a mistake, but I think it was like the 10th or 11th largest country if we put all of these people together, which of course, thank goodness, they're not all together. And most of them are living. There's a common misperception that refugees are mostly in camps. Refugees are mostly outside of camps, and internally displaced persons, people inside countries, are nearly double the amount of refugees. So there are fewer refugees, but now I think it's 45 million refugees and about 60 million or so IDPs. So the magnitude is enormous, and maybe just by ending in a positive note, that what we are seeing with studies from World Bank and other areas is that actually where refugees go, there's less data for IDPs. In the local economy improves, and there's been more and more evidence showing that, and there's a variety of reasons, but as opposed to refugees coming in and actually making a country poorer, in general, not everywhere, refugees actually, because of the international community coming in, because of the entrepreneurship of refugees and those around them, actually grow the local economy. And so if there was a way to harness that, we could take care of a lot of issues in many of these countries.
Paul, I want to thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the work you're doing in Gaza.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. As I said, I wish I could have been there in person, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.